Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. I'm Morgan McClintock, the CEO of startup marketing agency Firebrand. We've launched this podcast to interview the best in the business, but I'm not going to do it alone. So please meet my co-hosts.
I'm Nicole Pytel, Firebrand's VP of Content Marketing.
And I'm Chris Ulbrich, Firebrand's Head of Media Relations.
I'm Ian Lipner, a tech PR and crisis communications veteran.
We'll drop a new episode each week, so there's plenty of fuel for your marketing fire. Get the spark you need to take your startup to a whole new level.
Hello there, and welcome to another edition of Fired Up. My name is Ian Lipner, and I'm joined today by Nicole Pytel. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, Ian. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here today. We have such a brilliant friend on today who is talking about something that is just so incredibly important to every business, but especially startups who never seem to have enough time, money, or people. So why don't we jump into it? Go ahead and introduce our guest.
Yes, we're going to be talking about enablement. And I don't mean the bad thing that can happen in codependent relationships. I don't know all the details. I know it involves content, coaching, training, tech, but I'm not the expert. We're calling in the bigger guns. And today our expert is Stacey Justice, the Vice President of Go-to-Market Enablement for Gong, who lives in Salt Lake City, Utah. I first met Stacey many moons and brands ago, back when we were teaching people about complicated things like business service management. In the meantime, and prior to Gong, she led the global enablement teams at HashiCorp, which was acquired by IBM, and Workfront, which was acquired by Adobe. Over the course of her career, she has held roles in marketing, communication, sales, and a couple other ones we might ask about. But before we get into any of that, let's set the scene here, Stacey, and thank you for joining.
Hey, thank you. It's great to see you, Ian. And Nicole.
Of course. So let's talk about it. What is enablement, apart from your least favorite word?
Well, you kind of nailed it with my least favorite word in the fact that you can even just talk about enablement and codependent relationships. But it's funny. So enablement can mean a lot of things. I presented recently at a conference and it was around what is enablement and how do we actually define it? So I went to ChatGPT, like everyone does this, in this day and age, and came back with literally a 3-paragraph answer. And I think enablement was used in the definition of enablement. That's how much I love this word. But at the end of the day, what enablement really is, especially in the context of what we're talking about, is it's arming go-to-market teams, whether that be a sales team, customer-facing team, customer success teams, with the resources, tools, and skills that they need to be the most effective that they can in their job.
That was much better than ChatGPT probably did. You didn't even use the word delve.
I didn't even use the word enablement in the definition. Like that gets me extra points.
You beat the robot for sure. Let's talk about enablement at scale because we all love the word scale as well. Why is this so crucial for organizations?
It's really important for organizations who are looking to grow and to be predictable and repeatable in what they do and how they grow. So specifically, as an organization looks to add more sales reps or more customer success managers or the like, they need to be able to create and standardize on processes, on the approach or methodology, on how they sell or work with their customers, on their message, which obviously becomes really important from a marketing perspective. And in order to do that, they need to have an organization, a team, a person who's focused on helping them all get to that point of standardization and repeatability. So enablement, it's become kind of this like popular sort of term and group in recent years, but it's become really important for those teams to be able to get to doing the same thing, being consistent, getting more predictability, and really driving consistency across those teams as they continue to grow.
What does consistency mean in this context? What do we mean when we say, make things repeatable? What would it be otherwise?
So if you think about smaller companies and startups, one of the things that they're often doing is, hey, let's go figure out what works. So let's try all sorts of different approaches. Let's try different processes. Let's see how it works if we do our pitch, early in the process, or if we talk pricing early in process, and then let's see how that works if we do it later in a process. And they're really about testing and trying to figure out. But there's a point where you get to a place as an organization where you're like, this works. this is what we do, this is what we need to do, and let's repeat it. That's when organizations can say, hey, let's start to put together a sales process. It's kind of like the how on how you sell. Has key deliverables, exit criteria, and the like, and stages that a team would go through. And then as you follow through, that helps you to understand where a deal is in a process. So organizations that are looking to kind of standardize on that, get more predictability around where a sale is in the process. That's like kind of the primary use case and primary kind of start in terms of how you start to standardize on that process.
So what it sounds like is when sales teams are first digging in, they're learning what works. And you don't want to just add another salesperson who might just start trying to reinvent the wheel from the beginning when you've already learned, hey, these are the things that, move the needle for our prospects and for our goals.
Yeah. And I'll throw in another example too, because I think it's important, especially in today's age in tech, especially. Getting those new hires that you're ramping, those new sales reps that you're hiring, getting them to productivity, getting them to full quota, getting them to sell a deal faster actually helps you as a business, right? You start to bring in more revenue. So if you can get that to a predictability and say, hey, we know this works, and use an enablement team to help to onboard that and start to measure that and say, okay, it takes someone from X amount of time from start date to time to close, and we can improve that. That starts to become really compelling and valuable for organizations as they start to hire more people.
That is so important in the startup world because usually it's the founder or the two founders are going out, they're pounding the pavement themselves, they're trying to do the sales, they're figuring out what works, they know amongst themselves. And then when the lovely first world problem happens of having to onboard a sales team and all of that good stuff, they need to be as efficient as possible. And they're typically, from what I've seen, they're not really ready to do it. They just know the process, and it doesn't always occur to them that, no, we really have to spell out this process, and everybody kind of just goes doing their own thing.
No, you're absolutely right.
When we think about startups and when they first start out, Nicole's exactly right. Those founders are trying all the different scripts and they're seeing what works. And maybe the thing that works at the beginning changes over time as their offerings broaden out as well and they've got more opportunities to sell.
Totally.
Okay, how can this go wrong? It sounds like, let's just do a bunch of enablement. We'll create lots of great content. We know the kind of content that works. We'll just create more of that. We'll have the sales folks tell the other sales folks what work with them. Is it that simple? Or what are the mistakes that, you wrote a whole blog post about it.
I did.
Tell us about some of these mistakes.
First and foremost, a lot of the mistakes stem from that word enablement. Right? First and foremost, I think organizations, especially because it's become this term that's become really popular of late, and organizations will say, hey, we need an enablement team, or hey, we need an enablement person to come in and help us do this. So the first mistake I see organizations make is not defining what enablement means. And I will tell you firsthand, enablement means something different at every organization, just like it means something different every time you chat GPT the definition. So that's a big mistake. Not defining it, not creating a charter, not saying, hey, this is what success looks like for enablement, and tying it to those business goals. The second, I think, is taking a really reactive and task-focused approach. That means a lot of times organizations will align an enablement person to a leader, and that enablement person will just go and do everything the leader says. And instead of having a point of view or looking at data and looking at analytics to say, hey, we think this would work, or hey, from this perspective, these reps are doing it well, these reps aren't. How do we bring a point of view into the situation and become a lot more strategic on that? Third is not making the right investments in enablement. And I say this in that that's either making too many up front or not enough. Either side of that can be a mistake, especially when you're going from a small startup where you haven't had that, bringing in a person, letting that kind of build on its own to what the organization needs and then adding as it goes. That will actually help. And then continuing to add as the organization kind of scales. So it's making sure that it's growing with the organization at the right times and adding people as it kind of moves forward. And then finally, and I think this is it's actually something that reminds me a lot of marketing and Ian, especially when we were working in early days together. How do you truly define the value of what enablement's bringing? And remember, marketing used to have this challenge. There's all these tools out there that help marketers do that now, but it's aligning initiatives to the right business metrics. And, enablement can kind of sometimes gets stuck in the, what I like to call leading indicators. Hey, someone just completed a training, or hey, these people just, we've got a lot of downloads on this asset, in whatever tool, but they don't take it to the next step to say, how did that actually impact revenue? Or how did that impact overall business metric that's really important to that organization? And so I think if enablement's not aligning it to say, hey, I'm going to decrease ramp time, meaning I'm going to get people to their quota faster and it's going to generate this much more revenue, then they're kind of missing the ability and opportunity to find the value and what they're bringing to the business.
Okay, so the mistakes can be not aligning to the right metrics, not investing enough, or maybe not investing the right amount at the right time in enablement, not taking a proactive approach, but instead taking a reactive approach, and then finally never even truly defining it for your organization specifically.
Correct.
Those are some mistakes to look out for.
Those are some big ones. Yeah. So what happens? What does it look like when you make these mistakes? What are some of the consequences?
Well, one thing can be that you've got a team that you don't know what they're doing. If you look at it from that perspective, you say, okay, we just hired all these enablement folks. We have this team. What are we getting from it, right? You haven't defined a charter. You haven't really set out what the goals are. You haven't said, hey, this is what success looks like. So that's the first thing. And basically, I think you actually risk missing all of the goals that you were hoping to accomplish in the first place if you're really not putting some structure around it. And then building in effective programs, if they're not actually focused on those metrics, they're not actually delivering the right thing, it can actually lead to a decrease because the opportunity cost there is you're taking reps out of the field to do something, you're giving them the right, so there's an opportunity cost there too if you haven't aligned to the business need and what they look like and what's going to have the biggest impact.
Yeah, you don't want to be wasting people's time and energy. Time on the phone is, more time to sell, right? Or time on email. What do you think are the mistakes that people make most often? And why do they make those mistakes? Why would someone not define enablement, for example?
Why do you use enablement in the enablement definition? I don't know. I still haven't figured that out. I think the biggest thing is that enablement, it doesn't have a direct impact on revenue. It's influence, right? So enablement's all about how do we influence change? How do we make change? How do we change a behavior? And so it's one step removed from that actual business metric. And so I think the biggest struggle on all of those is lining to business metrics because it's not directly correlated to that. And so if you take ramp time as a metric, you can sit there and say, okay, these are the milestones that we've got in terms of getting a new hire to productivity. And so we're going to do that. But enablement isn't the only force there in terms of how you get it to productivity. Let's say that rep got a terrible territory. Well, that's not on enablement. That's influence, right? That's not there. So I think sometimes it just becomes difficult or it can be ambiguous. And so people stop trying to align those business metrics. And that's where enablement, from my perspective, what I've seen gets task driven or becomes kind of not as business value. So I think that it's really important to measure the impact of what's happening, recognizing, there are other things that are outside of it, but this program is specifically geared to drive new ramp time. And let's look at it holistically around what's happening. Otherwise, I think you run the risk of not measuring the impact and not having value and really having this team that's sitting there saying, but we're doing a lot of things, I promise, versus, hey, we just helped to decrease ramp time by 15%.
Sure. I mean, we've seen this in PR, right? We're getting the media hits, but it's not driving sales, right? And it's not just getting articles. It's making sure that those articles are expressing differentiation in our field.
Such a great analogy. Absolutely.
It seems like there's, a very fine line for some of these. If I'm a startup founder right now and I'm saying, oh gosh, we haven't even defined enablement, we're making this critical mistake, that one's pretty easy to spot. But some of them are more, am I doing this at the right time? Am I, things like that. So what's the best way for the companies to really sit down and assess, hey, are we making any of these mistakes? Because some might be pretty tough to spot.
I think the first thing is understanding kind of what's the impact? Can we answer the question, what impact is enablement having on my teams? What impact is enablement having on my, overall targets and numbers? Or are my teams improving? I think that is a big question. So if you've got enablement there, it's like, are my teams improving? And how is that happening? I think that's kind of a first question. Can you measure, like, is your enablement team talking in terms of business metrics? Are they looking at that and aligning programs to things that matter to the business? Or do you feel like you're kind of see that they're a little bit on the side? They might not be right aligned. It's kind of like that term. I wish there was like a really clear defined answer here, but I think it all comes down to impact. I think it comes down to saying, hey, can I tell you what they're doing? Do I think I'm getting value from this team? Or do we need this team? And I'm not trying to say get rid of enablement. Maybe we don't have an enablement team. We're saying, hey, we're really struggling here. How do we actually bring someone in that's going to help us and be focused full time on improving those reps and improving the way that we do things to kind of get there?
You mentioned that sometimes folks are reactive, right? And whoever their business leader is, they're doing the enablement tasks that that leader asked for. Taking a step back, what role does leadership play in the success of enablement programs? And that could include the leader of the program, but also those business leaders. And how do you make sure that you're creating a culture that supports it?
So a few thoughts here. One that I haven't talked about a lot that I'm going to call out here, and that I think is really important, is enablement needs a seat at the table with leadership. In order to take it from being reactive, task-driven, enablement needs to have a voice and a view into the strategies that are being defined and run by the organization and by leadership. So that's the first thing. And by doing that, you empower enablement. How about that? To partner with leaders to be able to deliver on the strategy and execute on kind of those objectives that and meet those objectives that they need to do. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, leaders are so critical to the effective kind of deployment and implementation of any enablement program. From my perspective, leaders should know about or have helped to build every program before it ever goes to the field. It doesn't always happen. A lot of times there's a lot of things that are like, hey, this is the most critical change that needs to happen. We need to do it now and it needs to happen. And leaders kind of get left out. But I think in order to have a really effective program or influence change the way that enablement needs to, it needs to have that partnership, because enablement's one to many. So enablement looks at this and says, hey, we're going to create this program and we're going to get this field, whether it's 10 reps, 50 reps, 5,000 reps, all doing the same thing, all rowing in the same boat. Awesome. But enablement's not sitting in the room coaching them on a one-on-one. Enablement's not sitting in a team meeting where you've got a manager to a team that's maybe 1-7 ratio. So it's important that leaders are there as kind of like that next step to help reinforce, to help drive, to help coach, to ensure that the objectives of that program are being met.
That makes sense. I mean, you don't want enablement to be tasked with trying to provide the coaching on an individual basis to folks. You want the folks who have the day-to-day experience of the interactions to show how to best use the content and materials that you've created and the ideas and so forth.
Yeah. And there's another pitfall that comes from this if it doesn't happen that I've seen, which is an interesting challenge. But sometimes enablement then takes the role of a leader or starts to do what you would consider that sales leader's job, or that, where they're driving accountability to the field. And one of the things I've said since I got into the enablement field is I don't have the authority to fire any rep. I can't tell you, like, if they're not doing what you expect them to do, I can't do anything about it. In effect, that means I'm not their leader. Right? So I shouldn't be doing the leader's job to be able to coach them and manage their performance. But sometimes that line gets blurry when the leader's not involved or they're not bought in, and enablement's kind of driving those programs. And so it's kind of that opposite problem versus what value they're playing. Now you've got an overpowered enablement team that's really acting as a leader.
Yeah, I want to get in an extra question here. Can you describe like a good partner with enablement from a sales leader versus somebody who's more difficult to work with?
Sales leaders are never difficult to work with. What are you talking about?
Never.
Yeah. So I think as a good sales leader is someone who recognizes the importance of growing and developing their teams, recognizes that they can't do it on their own. I truly believe this. I think first-line managers especially have one of the hardest jobs in a company. They're responsible for delivering a number, let's say. They're responsible for growing and developing their reps. They've got a lot of things to do. So recognizing that they can't do all of this on their own, recognizing that they have partnership and enablement, and participating up front in terms of like, hey, how are we going to actually solve this problem or do do something to help them, partnering with it, and then getting buy-in across their teams and coaching to it, right? So my ideal sales leader to work with is someone who truly believes in coaching and developing their reps and their teams, because those are the people who will really scale their organization. They move beyond becoming a super rep and doing everything for their reps, and they truly partner with enablement to get it done.
That's a great point, and you've done such a great job explaining the role of the people and how people are coming together and what good leadership looks like and what good partners look like. It's all the people side of things. So let's pivot a little bit. Where does technology come into play, especially when we talk about the almighty scaling enablement?
Yeah, or we can kind of start to drop this like AI term here too, right? Technology is so key. And I think it's always been key in terms of enablement. With enablement platforms are out there, let's even just say, how do you create a repository for all the content that you need to get them so that they know they've got the right content? But I think that AI is changing the way that sales teams operate. I think it's changed the way enablement works. It's providing an opportunity for enablement teams to honestly, rather than spending the time gathering the information they need, now they actually get to spend more time being strategic and understanding and analyzing data that's going to have really an impact on the business and help them to focus their programs more on what matters. Much like marketing and technology that came out and kind of opened like the door to like, honestly, like even read rates and who's answering my email, all that stuff. I remember the days, I'm aging myself so much, but I remember the days when that didn't exist. It's kind of the same for enablement. Now you've got things like conversational intelligence where you can actually have visibility into what are our reps saying? How are they communicating? Like, how are they deploying those discovery tactics that we just trained on? And so you've now got such a huge opportunity from an enablement perspective to really understand what's happening, kind of bridge the gap between just like enablement and reality, because you can hear what's going on and then you can focus your programs to really help improve it.
Yeah, I remember back in the day, you told me about Marketo for the first time. And I remember you calling it cheating.
Was.
Yes.
And now it's kind of like, we have just aged me so much in this call, but it's so true. And you're right along there with me. Marketo opened the doors when you were actually doing marketing. You had no visibility before then. And it's now ubiquitous. No marketer could do their job without a tool like that. And I think that's happening right now. AI and conversational intelligence are, like, my perspective, opening the door to provide visibility and really change the game. No question.
Talking about, just how things have changed, right? And how tech has changed. I have another sneaky question to stick in here. Do you feel like the folks that you work with, because of they grew up with this tech, right? We were talking in a previous podcast about Gen Z and how they're doing a lot of the research now. But the oldest Gen Z members are 26, and they might be the folks reading your enablement content and making recommendations. Have you noticed anything generational that's different about marketing, about like what the assumptions are of what we should know going into to an interaction?
Without a doubt. What you just targeted, let's just even say from a sales side, that age range is really kind of like your entry level, like sales reps. They're the sales development representatives, the SDRs. They research differently. They expect different types of information. They trust different sources than you used to have. They have a different level of, like, let's even just say like perspective of privacy, right? Like, I will tell you, like, they expect everything to just be kind of like open. They've been sharing everything their entire lives. So why can't I go find this in different things? And so I think there's an absolute difference, both in terms of how they approach it and also what they expect. I think technology has to stay up to speed with that. AI-based platforms are going to become absolutely not just critical, but they're going to become ubiquitous across that. I think it's just going to change the way, because that's what's expected with this Gen Z, this Gen Z workforce. And I think it's going to take an adjustment from those folks who've been in the workforce for a long time.
So what about, some best practices? Because you wrote this amazing blog post that Ian and I loved. We're going to link to it in the recap. So everybody listening, go read it. It's great. You listed out some great advice in there. What are some best practices that you didn't mention in there, that whether you're dealing with technology or Gen Z or just all the people together, like what are just some of the best ways to get things done?
One thing is that enablement's evolved, and we're probably like in that, in the peak of this, to be honest, but enablement's evolved to be a lot more than just sales. It's moving into like all customer facing roles. And so I think recognizing that and understanding kind of how all of that threads together and being ready to kind of enable and empower all of those customer facing teams. Like today, I have enablement responsibility from initial like inquiry pre-sales perspective all the way through the support team. And all of those roles are, customer facing. They are all in critical parts of the customer journey. And I think that that's just becoming something that enablement's really evolving into and owning. I think the second one is it is recognizing this new generation of technology and new generation of workers and technology and how it can help. And it's using that technology to help bridge the gap between reality and enablement. And so enablement used to be hypotheticals and training and standing there and content. Now enablement can literally be conversations that are happening, customer calls that you're doing, proof points, right? And so the more that you can provide real life scenarios, you can do things like that. I think it's important. And then I think the biggest thing is staying on top of technology. And I think that's just because it changes so fast and it's out there to kind of help optimize the way that all of those roles that you're supporting are working. And so since that's kind of one of the definitions in the ChatGPT definition of enablement, like I think that becomes really critical in terms of making sure you're effective.
Last question before we get into some of our FiredUp specials. You talked a little bit about metrics. You talked about ramp time. On the whole, how do organizations measure the ROI of their enablement programs?
First and foremost, and I'll say this, enablement should not be creating their own business metrics to measure, right? You can look at this. I have this like 3-tiered approach where you start looking at leading indicators, which leading indicators are those things that are maybe activity-based, things that you can course correct in time. So go back to that new hire example. Are they completing the new hire programs? Are they passing the certification programs on time? Are they doing that? That then leads up to what I would consider kind of a lagging indicator. Did they close their first deal on time? Are they getting to ramp on time? That then leads up to what I kind of consider the end all be all of enablement, which is rep productivity, right? So it drives up to say, every organization has an expectation that their sales reps are going to generate X amount of revenue. So how do you help drive that rep productivity number? And it all kind of goes up to that. But I think the biggest thing for that is that revenue operations teams, sales operation teams, and enablement need to be really kind of partnering hand in hand, aligned on what those key metrics are and working together to help improve them.
That's really helpful to people to have those 3 levels of sort of the metrics that you should be watching and understand that you don't get all the way to the first one before you do the leading indicators and the trailing indicators. This has been great. We want to know a little bit more about you, not just enablement. So I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, who's going to take you through our FiredUp 5.
Excellent.
This is where we enable you to have a little bit of fun and share some more about yourself. So, first question, what would you do if you weren't in sales?
Okay, so I'm going to take this to also if I wasn't in corporate, I would do something completely right brain, something really creative. I've recently picked up a habit of quilting and I would be a full-time quilter, period.
Amazing and so cozy. What is the best career advice you've ever been given?
I think it's to say yes to the opportunities in front of you. You'd have asked me back when Ian and I were working together if I was going to be an enablement leader, I probably wouldn't have had any clue or said no. So I would have said absolutely not. I think you say yes to the opportunities they're giving you. You never know where it's going to take you.
Awesome. What book do you most often recommend?
So I have a kind of a standard book that I go back to, and it's because it's an important characteristic for me, and that's Grit by Angela Duckworth.
Good one. Now, I know you have a good answer to this one. We've had some good answers, but you have a good answer. What is the strangest job you've ever done?
So I've kind of had a little bit of an interesting career trajectory, but I think first and foremost, I started my career as an investment banker doing mergers and acquisitions for aerospace and defense companies. So if you want to know anything about actuators and how they work on planes or financial statements, I can help you out.
All good stuff to talk about at a cocktail party. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And finally, amazingly, I don't know how we're here. We're almost halfway through 2024. What are you most excited about in the second half of the year?
You know, this is something I've recently started a new job and I've been here at Gong for about 4 months. I am most excited about the fact that I get to work with people who I really appreciate, admire, and a product I love. And so I couldn't be more excited for like the second half of 2024 and kind of seeing how all of that plays out.
All good stuff. Amazing.
Stacey, thank you so much. You've given us a crash course on go-to-market enablement, and I am going to keep an eye on ramp time from now on.
Excellent.
Stacey Justice, the Vice President of Go-to-Market Enablement for Gong, thanks again. This has been Fired Up.
Well, that about wraps it up for today. But before we close, we did want to offer all of our Fired Up friends a chance to grab a mega pack of all of our ebooks and guides. That's our guide to content marketing. That's our startup guide to paid media using Google Ads. It's our guide to attribution. You can get all of those, over 100 pages of goodness, at firebrand.marketing/firedup freebies. That's freebies with an S. And we hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, or drop us a note at firebrand.marketing. And as ever, the details of how to get in touch with our guest today can be found in the show notes. Thank you for listening. And until next week, get out there and crush your marketing goals.